Hello. Today I'll talk about blockchains. Because what are blockchains? How do they work? Who invented the blockchains? And what kind of impact can blockchains actually have on the society and the financial sector as we know it? So blockchains are many things to many different kinds of people. To some people, a blockchain is just a decentralized currency. It's a new monetary system. It's a new way of creating money. It's a new way of transacting money. But to some people, a blockchain is a political tool. It's a way to challenge the status quo. It's a way to challenge these very powerful financial institutions, these very powerful governments, and these very powerful banks. So a lot of people are in blockchain to create some sort of revolution. There are many different kinds of revolutions. Some are big, some are small, but a lot of people in the blockchain space are very, very motivated by the political aspects. Some people are not motivated by politics at all. They might just be technologists or futurists who just think that blockchains is a new type of database. It's a new way of sharing information. It's a new way of creating better computer systems. And then again, to the more ambitious technologies, the blockchain is a new type of distributed computer. A blockchain might be a global computer that we all share. So instead of uploading your programs or your services to, say, Microsoft or Amazon, you just upload your programs directly to the blockchain. You can create your own sharing economy platform directly on a globally accessible blockchain. But to understand what blockchains are, we have to understand where they came from. We have to understand how the people who invented blockchain technology were thinking. Now, the idea about digital cash, the idea about distributed systems, originate all the way back from the middle of the 1980s. And it became very popular in the 1990s, the early 90s, with the rise of the internet, because that meant that all these computer scientists, all these engineers, all these political activists, they suddenly had a medium where they could discuss these things. They had a platform to discuss how we could create better societies. They wanted to use cryptography, use mathematics, use technology to create a society where everyone were entitled to communicate privately, to communicate anonymously with each other. They wanted to make sure that every citizen could send an encrypted message to someone they knew. But at the same time, they wanted to use this technology to create more transparency in government. So they wanted to create a system where instead of the citizens were fearing the government would fear the citizens, because the data would be free, data would be open. One of the most famous of these people, these so-called cypherpunks, is probably the famous or infamous Julian Assange, who was a hacker from Australia, but he was also a political activist. He created the well-known whistleblower site, WikiLeaks, where people could anonymously share confidential information from government. They could tell what went on in the Afghanistan war. They could tell what happened at the Guantanamo Bay prison. And that was a very good example of one of these cypherpunks, how they saw technology as improving society. And one of the things that these cypherpunks had wanted to create all the way back since the 1980s was digital cash. They wanted to create a monetary system where everyone in the entire world could send confidential transactions. They could send money directly to each other without the involvement of government, without the involvement of central banks. But all these previous attempts of creating digital cash schemes, they failed. So they tried since the middle of the 1980s, but all of them failed. And there are several reasons for why these digital cash schemes failed. The first one is that it's often not legal to create your own money. So if you ran your own server with your own private money, you'd probably get a visit from a guy like this. And if this guy was in a good mood, he would just take your computer, he would give you a slap on the wrist and say you can't make your own money. If he was in a bad mood, he would take your computer and he would take you and he would put you in jail. So there were high stakes if you tried to create digital cash. There was also the people who tried to create the digital cash systems within the limits of the law. And they also found out that it's actually not very easy to create digital money, especially when you're not a bank or when you're not a central bank. So they ran into a ton of regulatory problems. And again, all these attempts failed. Then, of course, there were the last type of attempts, which were essentially a lot of systems created like pyramid schemes. It was criminals, and when they had enough money in the system, they would just shut it down, and they would leave with everyone's money. And that was all because these systems were dependent on central entities. There was always a server, there was also always a board, there was always a company in the middle of these digital cash systems. And that was until 2009, where this famous pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto invented the blockchain. So the missing piece was the blockchain. And to give a bit of background story, back in 2009, there was an online forum where a lot of these cypherpunks were still discussing how to create digital cash. And then this guy, this anonymous guy who called himself Satoshi Nakamoto, came out of nowhere and said, "Hey guys, I think I actually solved the problem. I have a solution on how to create a peer-to-peer digital cash system." And his solution was the blockchain. So back in 2009, Satoshi, he started the Bitcoin blockchain. And he did this with a very, very specific political statement, because not only did he start the blockchain, but the very basis of the blockchain was a sentence that he took out of the New York Times back in 2009. And the headline of this article described that now there was a new bailout for these too big to fail banks. And the fun fact is that every transaction that's ever done in the Bitcoin blockchain, even up to today, are still connected to that very sentence. It's mathematically and cryptographically connected to that sentence. So what Satoshi did, he stuck a big middle finger to the banks when he created Bitcoin. So he was very political back then. But he also made a very important technological achievement. He created the first ever blockchain. And at the same time, he created the first ever digital cash system. And what's probably most fascinating about Bitcoin is not how it was created or why it was created, but it is that it's still working today. So ever since 2009, Bitcoin has been working more or less as Satoshi intended it. So he actually got it right the first time, which is very, very impressive. So how do blockchains actually work? Now, a blockchain is based on what's called a public ledger, a public distributed ledger. And this ledger contains a lot of transactions. And an easier way to think of this is to think of a public ledger as just a globally shared spreadsheet. It's just a spreadsheet with a lot of transactions. And then just this spreadsheet is shared between thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands and millions of people. And they will contain every transaction ever made on this public ledger, on this blockchain. So everyone can see all transactions all the time. And at the same time, we have some very specific rules on how we update this ledger. So everyone, all these thousands of people who have the entire ledger, the entire spreadsheet, they know exactly the rules for how to add new transactions. And that is how a blockchain works. That is how a ledger works. We have a ledger, a public ledger, and then we have the rules of interaction, the rules of creating new transactions. And a good way to symbolize this, to make an analogy, is if we go to the island of Yap in the Pacific Ocean. This is a very interesting island, both in the eyes of anthropologists and economists, and also blockchain enthusiasts, because what they did there is they perhaps invented something which is quite similar to the first blockchain. So the island of Yap is out here in the middle of nowhere. And the closest neighbor they have is a small island called Palau, which is 400 kilometers away. And back in time, they invented their own financial system. They invented their own money. They invented their own blockchain. So this is a rhinestone. It's a huge limestone disk. It's not very handy, and it's not even native to the island of Yap because there are no limestones in the island of Yap. So to get limestones to this island, you would have to take a canoe and you have to paddle 400 kilometers to Palau because Palau had limestone. And then you bring this scarce resource back to Yap. Now you had something that was in very, very short supply. So you could sort of call this a type of currency because people wanted this limited resource. But at the same time, you also needed a way to transact these huge, very immobile limestone disks. So what they would do is they would take the disks and they would put them down on the city square. Now, if I wanted to buy something with my disk, let's say I wanted to buy a canoe from my neighbor, I would actually call everyone who lived in the city down to the city square. And then I would publicly declare this change of ownership. I would tell everyone that now I'm actually giving this stone to my neighbor. Now, since everyone saw the transaction, since everyone sees all transactions, I won't be able to use this stone, this rhinestone, to pay for something else the day after. And that's essentially the same thing that blockchains do. On the island of Yap, we have unique tokens. They're rhinestones. It's a limited resource. It's something that people want. It's something that they desire because it can be used as money. But at the same time, we also have these very well-defined rules. We have a public exchange of ownership. So when everyone sees all transactions all the time, nobody can be cheated. And nobody can spend the same money twice. This is very, very similar to how the Bitcoin blockchain works. On the Bitcoin blockchain, we still have a unique token. That's just called Bitcoin. It's just digital. But at the same time, we also have this very well-defined set of rules for how we update the ledger, for how we make new transactions. Now, of course, we also have some more modern technology. We also have something as computers, so we can update this ledger several times a second. And we also have something like unforgeable, digital, cryptographically secure signatures. So, of course, our blockchains are much more efficient than those of the islanders. At the same time, we also have a way of generating new bitcoins, which is kind of similar to what they did in the Pacific Ocean as well. Because in the Bitcoin network, we have something called Bitcoin miners. And they take on the same role as the islanders who were paddling the canoes to and from Palau. They took a risk, they spent some resources, and then they got something that was scarce in return. So the Bitcoin miners, they're using their computer power, they're using a lot of power, they're using a lot of energy, and they're using expensive computers to solve mathematical equations. And by doing this, they can prove to the Bitcoin network that they put in some work and that they deserve to get some Bitcoins back. Now, I know this sounds a bit abstract. It is, but that's how it works. You put in power, you put in new computer power, and then you get Bitcoins in return from the Bitcoin network. Everything is put into these well-defined rules, so everyone knows what they can expect. But it doesn't have to be just Bitcoins that we put on a blockchain. We can put anything on a blockchain. We have something as the Bank of England that are looking into putting currencies on the blockchain, looking into how we can actually use blockchains to create better transaction systems for the British pound. We also have the option of putting stocks on the blockchain. Pretty much everything that can be digital can be put on a blockchain. We have this big consortium called R3, which is a group of approximately 50 banks. We also have some Danish banks in that consortium. We have Danske Bank, we have Nordea, and we have SEB. And what they're doing is that they're looking at blockchain technology to see how they can make faster, better, cheaper transactions more securely by using blockchain technology. And as the last example, since anything that can be made digital can be put on a blockchain, why not just take something that's already immaterial, something like a ticket, that's something everyone knows. We also know that if you want to sell a ticket, you have to sell them this piece of paper or this PDF file that can easily be copied. So if I wanted to buy a ticket of someone, I had to trust that they haven't made photocopies of my ticket. But let's say that the ticket is on the blockchain. Let's say that I actually have some type of blockchain currency to pay with. That could be Bitcoin. Now I could actually engage something called a smart contract with the seller. So he would put in the ticket into a smart contract. And he would say, as soon as I'm paid, say 0.1 Bitcoin, then we'll do the transaction automatically. So as soon as I pay his contract, he gets the Bitcoins and I'll get the ticket. And we wouldn't have to trust each other because we did it on the blockchain. And everything will be secured by the blockchain. So what are the problems that blockchains actually do solve? And to put it short, blockchains remove the need for trusted third parties. And what is a trusted third party? Well, to an individual consumer, a trusted third party is a bank. A bank handles your money. They hold your money in account. They send transactions. They send your money. And they receive money on your behalf. So a bank is a very, very large third party. So if I go out and buy Bitcoin, I don't need the bank. I eliminated that third party. But at the same time, a blockchain is both something decentralized. It's something like Bitcoin. But at the same time, it's also a technology that the banks can use themselves. Because banks also have third parties. They're heavily reliant on intermediary steps when they say want to make an international transaction. So if a bank or a large group of banks can create a blockchain network, they might be able to eliminate their third parties and make a better and more efficient infrastructure for themselves. At the same time, blockchains can also create more transparency in accounting. Because if I'm a business that does blockchain transactions and all transactions on a public ledger, then everything is transparent. If somebody asks me, where did you get those money? I can just point to a transaction. I got a call from my bank because I received some money from the United States, and they didn't know where the money came from, even though they went through banks. If that transaction came through a blockchain, I could just point directly to the blockchain transaction and see that's where I got my money. And at the same time, blockchains introduce a lot of new ways to make financial transactions more efficient. If we can define all the rules by which we interact in code, everything will become automatic. To the banks, a blockchain might not be this revolutionary technology, but it might just be, as I mentioned earlier, a new type of database. Banks and financial institutions got a lot of old legacy IT infrastructure. And since much of that has to be updated anyway, why not take the best elements from the blockchain technology to improve your own systems, to minimize cost, and to make more efficient systems? Right now, in the blockchain environment, we have some certain types of services on their way. Of course, everything started with Bitcoin. Everything doesn't necessarily end with Bitcoin, but everything started with Bitcoin. So a lot of the blockchain services that we see today are Bitcoin related. We have a lot of services like exchanges, brokers, remittance services, wallet services, essentially banks for Bitcoin, where they handle your Bitcoins and take responsibility for the security. So we have a lot of traditional Bitcoin companies growing up. We have some interesting brokers in Denmark as well. We have some payment service providers in Denmark. We have large international players that are building an entire infrastructure to help Bitcoin integrate with the traditional financial system. We have companies such as NASDAQ looking into using blockchain technology to create more efficient stock trades. We have consortiums like R3 who looks into making a wide array of blockchain-related services. That could be compliance, sharing KYC compliance products. It can be international transactions from the Middle East to Asia. and all types of transactions that can benefit from distributed ledgers. But what about the future of blockchains? Where are we going right now? As a consultant in Denmark, I'm so glad to be part of the Copenhagen FinTech Hub, which is positioned at Finansforbundet at Christianshavn. So I'm actually sitting next to some of these very, very entrepreneurial individuals that are building infrastructure to push blockchains out into the financial sector. There's a lot of entrepreneurs right now that sees a new market. They see both the ability to deliver products to the financial sector, but perhaps they are the ones developing the new blockchain systems. But they also see a way to take some market shares from the financial sector. We have companies that are working towards creating cheaper international transactions using Bitcoin, and that way circumventing the traditional financial sector. So there's a lot of disruption, there's a lot of co-creation, there's a lot of interesting things going on in Copenhagen right now. And when I talk about blockchains and where we are right now, I usually compare it to the first iPhone. So back in 2007, Steve Jobs introduced the first Apple iPhone. And a lot of people got very excited. But if you look at the product isolated, the first iPhone couldn't do a lot of stuff that traditional phones couldn't do. But a lot of people didn't see an iPhone, they saw a platform. They saw a new way of interacting with technology and interacting with the internet. And I see the same thing happening with blockchains right now. So we have a platform, we have a technology that works. It's not very accessible, it's very expensive, but we have a lot of very, very skilled individuals working to program all these new apps. And I do believe that within a few years, we're going to have this app store moment. We're going to have this point in history where blockchain technology applications will become accessible to everyone. It might be for concert tickets, it might be for banking, it might be for remittance. It all depends on what people are going to develop. But as soon as we have this app store moment, I think that's going to be a defining point in history for blockchain technology.